This is Ashley Newby, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, cultural workers, political organizers, and everyone in between in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Black Studies Podcast with me, Ashley Newby, and John Drabinsky.
It's good to see you.
Today, we have Dr. Cona Marshall, who is an assistant professor of American religions in the Religions and Classics Department at the University of Rochester. Welcome, Cona. Thank you so much for being here today. How are you?
Hey, thank you both so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So we really want to get your perspective on Black studies. And to start, we want to talk about how did you get into Black studies as a field? What drew you in and what keeps you committed to the field of Black studies?
What got me, I guess what wrote me in, you might know a little bit about this, Ashley, is, or Dr. Newby rather, is McNair. Being a McNair scholar, I don't think I had it on my radar. I think I wanted to be a social worker. And I got wrapped in through McNair, and it had me thinking about different questions. During the time I was at McNair, it was, I'm dating myself now. It was Obama was running for president, and the first time, and they had come against his pastor at that time, the Dr. Reverend Jeremiah Wright, for some kind of inflammatory language in his sermons. And I didn't understand why. As an undergraduate student, I had heard people on Fox and other news stations kind of go at this pastor, and to me, I didn't hear anything different from what I had heard in my churches over the course of the year. So that took me to seminary, and then after looking into some African American preaching courses and stuff like that, I knew I wanted to go and explore Black language, Black consciousness a little bit more, that I didn't find in the seminary. I definitely went over theology and homiletics and stuff like that, but it didn't give me, those fields didn't give me what I needed in terms of, Black culture and Black language and that kind of relationship thereof. So McNair took me to graduate school, and graduate school sent me to Black studies to answer those questions.
So I want to ask you about how you imagine the field of Black studies. I mean, it has like every emerging field 50, 2, 3, 4 years ago. So a recent origin story, and its origin story is really in student protest and faculty support or resistance. Every protest has its resistance. And so it's really born of this political moment of activism in the late 1960s and early 1970s. But part of what sort of came along with that, and I think part of what drove that political movement to establish Black studies, was a desire to have the Black intellectual tradition represented. And so, what's always interested me about the field, both historically, but also in terms of it being a field that we always have to think about, in the present and think about its constant reinvention, is how to think about that tension between the political demands and the really politicized moment of its founding, but also the desire to focus field of Black studies around the study of the Black intellectual tradition. So sort of intellectual tradition, radical politics, these are both such an integral part of what Black studies was at its origins. And it seems like we're constantly negotiating that one way or another. I'm just curious how you think about the sort of origins of the field and, how you imagine it in the present and obviously also into the future.
Thank you for that question. It's interesting because I hear the history of the Black studies, kind of like on San Diego State, where the students were protesting to create the first Black Studies program.
San Francisco State, yeah.
San Francisco. I love San Diego, but
me too.
so nice. My apologies. But for me, it's a little bit more recent than that. When I was at my last institution as the director, they wanted to bring someone in to kind of direct Black Studies at Lebanon Valley College. That was based out of student protest. The position was created out of student protest. So that was 2016, and that would have been the first tenure track Black person they had at that institution, and it's over 200-year history. So that was, coming out of graduate school, I was positioned right into a more present history for that. Yeah. And similarly here, there was protest for Black Studies here at Rochester, and this has been its inaugural year of becoming a department. So I kind of find myself, of course, not experiencing what they experienced then, but on the kind of groundwork of trying to push those and wrestling with those ideas. How political are we? Are we protesting? Are we doing these things? And I think that's right in line. So for me, it's not too far back. And I was on the search for the director of this, or the department chair, as well as their first two hires. So it's kind of right now for me. And I think even as we met to think about the curriculum for Black Studies here, as the only PhD in Black Studies in the curriculum meeting, thinking about what that means, right? What is this going to look like, and knowing where I came from. So it's always positioning. So I think the history is kind of ever present here and now. Even at Rochester, I think they've hired a couple more people, and I think that they've done an excellent job. Shout out to the department chair, Jeffrey McCoon, doing a phenomenal job. They just got an amazing grant. They've hired more people, and I'd say the future is what they're doing. And one of those things is centering identities that haven't been censored in the past. So, they're mindful of hiring people and adding people to the faculty who are doing phenomenal work in feminist studies and queer studies and things like that. So I see it ever present. I mean, they're building. And so what way to build like that for the future, I think is phenomenal, is bold. And hopefully it's working.
I mean, it's interesting hearing you talk and sort of saying, the past conditions are, so similar in the Lebanon Valley State example or experience you had. It is also interesting for me thinking about how just 10 years ago in a Black Studies department, arguing for hires was, what we do in the contemporary university is grow Black Studies. But I do think, especially just over the last 3 or 4 years with this freak out over critical race theory, we're kind of back to that moment of like, it's actually pushing boundaries and pushing buttons and inviting controversy to even utter valuing this kind of field of study. Absolutely. People think about, can I say this aloud? It's much different than it was 10 years ago. I felt personally emboldened to do these kinds of protests and things, whereas now I feel a lot more silenced and scared about that kind of activism, for sure. Which I just have to, underscore that you're in Rochester, which is where the North Star was founded. Right. Just given its abolitionist history, this is...
Right. It was published in the basement of a Black church, AME church.
And so,
for sure.
So that kind of fear about activism is just sort of a wild historical sight to be having that. So.
Right.
Yeah.
It is. That's Ironic for sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Irony is the only word I could come up with as well. But I think there's lots of unspoken qualifiers on that
one. Absolutely. Probably, yeah. Unspoken, I like. Mm-hmm.
So kind of building on that, right? And I know because we did get our PhDs together, how that process looked to get a PhD in African American and African Studies, how our program was situated so that you had your core courses, but then we also had to take courses in more traditional disciplines, right? So currently now, being someone who initially had that first job where you were supposed to pretty much start this Black Studies program, and now being technically in the Department of Religion and Classics, but still very much a Black Studies PhD and work that is rooted in the field of Black Studies. How do you situate yourself in relationship to the disciplines? Like, how do you see yourself crossing these multiple disciplines that you have had to interact with, whether by choice or by nature of the way things have played out?
Yeah, I love how you asked that question. I'm going to try to piece it together because we did go to grad school. And so you can call me on this if I'm wrong, because it's something I think about all the time. So you let me know. And so the way Dr. Newby laid it out is in our graduate program, you took our core classes, and then how I see it, I don't want to, because I think everyone was fabulous there. How I understood it was that we outsourced our methods. And I've always seen that for Black Studies. And so my methods, quote unquote, were outsourced in rhetoric department. So I learned theory and methods of rhetoric while being a Black Studies major. So then in building it, I think about, are we outsourcing our methods? What are methods of Black Studies? And I think so many traditional disciplines get to name their methods. They get to name their theories. And so often Black Studies doesn't. And I don't know, right? I was in that position for only a couple years and didn't see as much traction as we would have liked. But that was something that was essential to me. Now that I'm in religion, my tenure comes from religion, I see myself navigating all of those disciplines. I'm interdisciplinary in nature, looking at African American feminist rhetoric, religious rhetoric, homiletics, and theology. So I'm always kind of CRT. I'm always trying to have these in conversation, but always centering Black women. So I really try to get most of my theory, if not all of my theory and methods, from Black women, right? I don't know if Black Studies are going to claim these methods and theories. Usually they are from ethicists, homileticians, and rhetoricians, typically Black women. That's kind of how I negotiate the disciplines and how I've seen it happen. I'd love to see Black Studies just lay stake on some of these things we talked about, the history of it building, the Black intellectual kind of building. And I think that's when it was maybe, officially started, right? Or right when you have David Walker and Du Bois making some great claims in theory, and potentially methods as well. So I'd love for Black Studies to kind of lay claim in that, so that we don't outsource it to sociology or education or rhetoric. But I do know that on this side it is difficult because we hired no one from Black Studies. Or that's not a dig. That's just, they were amazing qualified candidates that I endorse 1000%. But then what does that look like? It happens. So, and I think our Black Studies department was probably the same way. I don't know that anyone had a PhD in Black Studies, right? It was history.
Right? Because I think that they were just getting the first ones out when we were there, right? And so it was all traditional disciplines, but I think that part of that was rooted in the, deliberate under-resourcing. The fact that we were a program and not a department, we didn't have anybody who was fully in the African American and African Studies PhD program. Even our chair was 50%.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
There weren't any.
Yeah, and so that's difficult, right? That's difficult when I can see it on so many sides, and I thank you for bringing in that perspective of it. Yeah, I think that I believe they got the Mellon Fellowship. They have a lot of backing to hire who they want, and I think they're doing a phenomenal job of getting Black Studies people. But I don't know. I think that's up for debate. But for me, that's how I feel about it in terms of Black Studies. And so, if someone tells what is a Black Studies method, most it's been outsourced.
Yeah, I think that idea of the outsourcing of methods and bringing it back inside the area study, I mean, that ends up being kind of the borderlands between area studies and disciplines, right? It's a question of what is your distinctive methodology.
Exactly.
I remember giving a talk, not to just talk about myself, but
no, please.
And anecdotally, I gave a talk on a talk on Spike Lee a handful of years ago at the Society for Media and Cinema Studies, and I had half the paper was what I called a Black Studies cinema method, and or method for reading cinema. I had some pithy way of putting it at the time, but that was the only thing anyone wanted to talk about, because it was like, oh, we never thought, these were not Black Studies people. They never thought like, well, maybe there's something distinctive about Black Studies. It's not just sort of where you keep Black faculty away from the disciplines,
absolutely,
or where you keep people who work on Black texts, but instead that there's this, but when I was writing it, there were so few resources in terms of I didn't have this big critical apparatus to say, I'm working with this as a background and doing this nuanced thing, which is what so many disciplines are able to do, right? I love that imperative to develop a sort of theory of methods or collection of methods. So.
Which I think is even harder, right? When you don't have a critical mass of Black Studies PhDs who have been trained in methods that could be considered Black Studies. When you do have so many people who are from traditional disciplines, amazing, do great work, they were trained in that discipline. And so those are the methods that they're bringing with them to these departments as well. So,
yeah, it's hard. It's hard.
So on that note, I'm interested, you did your PhD as a doctoral student in Black Studies. You worked in Black Studies, designing a program, and now you work in a religion and classics department, which I love that as a combination, but that's for another conversation.
Thank you.
I think
like Martin Luther King or something.
It's totally interesting. But on this note of sort of methodologies, on the one hand, there's this sort of field, and what does the field have in terms of a sort of quill of methods to approach different topics or different areas of interest. So there's that sort of broad, area of study question, but there's also the specific question of you and your own experience. And so I'm curious, in that movement between being doctorally educated, I don't know if that's the way you're supposed to put it, but getting your doctoral education in Black Studies, and then now working in a non-Black Studies department on Black Studies material, and just how that mixture of approaches to be working in a discipline. I think religious studies could be called a discipline. The fact that you can say homiletics, right, tells you that it has disciplinary features at the very least. But how sort of working in a discipline has or is starting to change your approach to Black Studies material, or how your Black Studies education is changing as you encounter these different approaches to religious studies and its questions? In other words, sort of how one training and then being in a discipline, how these are impacting you as a thinker and as a teacher as well.
Yeah, I love the question. I do want to say another little piece about the underfunding and
Yeah, please.
the difficulty. I loved being at LVC, my little college, and it had its trials, but I loved it. Another one of the hard things was bringing on people that I thought would be valuable to the program, because you're piecemealing like we did, or bringing people, and there were disciplines that just outright did not want to be a part. So yeah, that's a piece of it too. What can you get from it, but also where we may need to go in the future. But in terms of my, in terms of which is informing what, Black Studies is informing everything for me. Um, I'm always asking the question of research, where and when do I enter, which I think Black Studies, critical race theory asks us to do. And I think other disciplines ask us to do, but may have forgotten to ask some people to do. So when I'm looking at homiletics or the art of preaching and this kind of historiography of who we're privileging as preachers, and Augustine and all of these other Greco-Roman philosophers. There you are. What does that have to do with me? And how we use rhetoric within Black spaces. So I think for me, it's all about definitely using the lens of Black Studies to guide how I'm understanding the other disciplines for sure. Because I think if I don't know if I'm doing Black Studies. I think I'm doing something else. Yeah.
And one thing that strikes me listening to talk about that is how that strong foundation in Black Studies makes a totally different relationship to the strength of disciplines, which are sometimes centuries old in the way they are so imposing. But when you have that really strong foundation in an area of studies like African Americans or Africana studies, all of a sudden, like encountering those disciplines is like you assimilate it in the sense of like, when you eat something, it becomes part of your body, but it's still your body, right? So I really like that as one of the reasons to really see the importance of that, of a PhD in Black Studies. Because those other disciplines don't overwhelm; they just become a contribution to the field.
Yeah, you know what? I think it's a little extra work. My colleagues don't have to know Black religious traditions, and I have to know Euro-Western religious traditions. I have to know, because if I can't insert our certain hermeneutics or interpretation of what's going on, which all of it's kind of filtered through interpretation, which is what I think critical race theory is trying to get us to understand. So it's a little bit more work on our end. And I think you were asking when I switched disciplines. So doing a PhD in Black Studies and then going to kind of try to start a Black Studies program. I'm trying to figure out, how do I get all of these pieces? We had a historian, we had a philosopher, how do I get these people to kind of come together for Black Studies? And it was more difficult than I imagined, right? That chairs were like, absolutely not. Don't talk to my professors. Shout out to the psych department at Lebanon Valley College. Which is for me especially hurtful, because I love Frantz Fanon and that's his training. And so to know that my students wouldn't be able to kind of have that kind of, I mean, they would, but but from those students wouldn't get that kind of welcome to another kind of discourse. And then coming to religion, I knew I had to. You know what? I wish I could just say, oh yeah, it's this love of Black people and all of these things. I loved LVC, and I would have stayed there until I retired. Um, Humanities probably was not going to stay there much longer.
Wow.
So it was the writing was on the wall there. Um, the religion department, the Black study, I mean, everything was folding.
Yeah.
So as everything's folding, do I look to say, okay, I'm going to find another Black studies department and figure out what kind of questions I was asking at the time? I really did have to figure out where the market was going. And I was asking religious questions through the lens of Black women. So this job came about, and it was looking for someone who was doing the things I was doing with Black studies. So, and for me, it was a little less scary, even though it's still in the humanities, than the smaller college, who wasn't probably able to give the humanities what it needed, financially. So while yes, it's theoretical and some emotive responses to the decision, there's a lot of practical decisions about where humanities were. I'm a fellow right now on sabbatical through our Humanities Center, who brings in fellows every year here at University of Rochester. We even have a presidential dinner tonight. So that's a lot different than the humanities where I came from.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
So, not switching gears completely, right? But like
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
same vein,
Mm-hmm.
I did education was my specializations. That's where all of my methods um,
Yep.
came from. But we have had many conversations about teaching. We have taught in each other's classes. We've had many
Absolutely.
conversations about the professors that we have had. Um,
Absolutely.
how do you think that your work as a teacher is informed by Black studies?
Oh, wow. Yes. Well, we started this off about kind of the tradition of Black studies, how it came to be, the activism, the protest. Um, One of the things that even in developing that first Black studies program was a relationship to community. And I ensure that I do that in my class all the time, whether it's creating a community amongst the class, but getting us out in community. Like you said, we're in Rochester. I did a talk and I'm like, you all have never been through the Underground Railroad passages around here. There's never been, there's no path here. There's no mark. It's just,
Wow.
it's beyond me that this is here and nobody's teaching it. Nobody's teaching Frederick Douglass. No one's teaching about the Underground Railroad. Now they are. I'm teaching the Underground Railroad, but um, I think that that's foundational to Black studies, is to be in community, to serve, and so I try to make those connections in all of my classes. Absolutely. So one of my classes, and we'll do it again. We virtually did the Underground Railroad tour, and then we actually took the tour. It's a little underwhelming in that, it's parking lot. Most things are like
Jeez,
parking
yeah.
lot.
Yeah.
I mean, it was underwhelming to me, maybe not my students as much, but, we did get to, fill those parking lots with stories of history. That Frederick Douglass penned, that a lot of people penned about the richness of this space. And so I think it robbery. Do I not get my students in this community and touch this community and figure out, we watched Harriet, we read about Harriet, and to know that this is the space that was referred to as the last 100 miles by a lot of enslaved people trying to reach freedom, trying to get to Canada, and the part that Rochester plays in it. So I think that the epicenter or the starting of Black studies, even the connection to, I didn't get that in religion. I didn't get that in rhetoric. I didn't get that in, uh, maybe sociology, but in French. What else did I major in? French. So yeah, I didn't
You were
get those in those
science
other
for a
majors.
while, weren't you?
Yeah, I did do that in that. Sociology, religion, and French. That's what I did in undergrad. But there was a call to maybe observe communities, but not to be amongst it and to see, and to live it. So, in my teaching, I want students to be there. At LVC, we travel to these different religious communities just to see, hey, I mean, in Lancaster, they have the most churches per capita in the world. They have the largest Amish population, and Mennonite. And most of us, including myself, had never even been in a Mennonite church. I was like, can I go? What did that look like? So to, I get that from Black studies, to be in the community. Absolutely. We have to be connected, because then what are we doing? Right? What are we, if it's not for the people? So I think I get that from you too. I think you definitely design, keep community engaged classes, that I try to model for my students as well. Absolutely.
That was directed towards Ashley, not me. I'd love to take credit for that, but it's not a strength of my teaching.
I appreciate that. Not sure how true it is, but I appreciate it.
That's true.
Well, let me ask a sort of big speculative question. It's 5+ decades of Black studies to look back on, and I'm curious, when you look back on the field, what do you think the field has done particularly well, but also what you think the field has not done particularly well in the past?
In the past, I think it's a great question. I do think that it is, because I can see it here at Rochester, it has begun to open up to different identities, in terms of, maybe sexual orientation and gender a little bit more. I've seen, as a discipline, and have been a product of developing PhD students in the discipline. I think they've done that well. I think they've produced a lot of scholarship, that pushes against normative traditions of ways of knowing, right? So I think they really have pushed it. And I think that they can continue to do that, and even more so. I think, what was it? Futurism, Afrofuturism became huge in the past, like 15 years or so.
Yeah.
So you get to see some of that. I'd love to see it begin to, do some more critiques of its own institutions, like the religious traditions. But I'd like to see it grow. Like we talked about methods. I'd like to see it lay some stake to methods. That's a huge one for me. I'd like to see it do something with, it's kind of scary, honestly. We talked about it a little bit, but it's kind of scary in some states where, some of its theories are politicized in a way where it's almost illegal, to teach it. So I don't know what we do with that. I don't. I'd like to see us continue. I'd like to see us continue pushing theory, in these big areas. I'm in religion. I don't see us pushing too far, but um, I'd like to see us push even further. There's a small sect of humanists, in Black communities, but I think that's not representative of the actual, community. I think there's probably more now. But I'm interested in Black studies. I love to see it growing. I thought that it was at a place and coming up because we were at Michigan State, where we did have this program that was producing PhDs. And again, at Rochester, we had this institute, the Frederick Douglass Institute, for so long. I don't have the answers. I wish I did have the answers, but I don't know if the answers are departmentalized, right? I don't know if it's to lay stake in a method. I don't know that I have the answers, but I do want them to continue to push narratives that have not included them. And that's what I would like to see continue to happen. And push disciplines. So there are some disciplines that are around because of the strength of Black studies and area studies. I won't list them, but there are some. I could, but there are some that are still here because of the strength of Black studies. Yeah, I just like I like to see it, but I don't have the answers. I know we hired an ecologies and a Black ecologist, I believe, recently, and queer studies. So I think it's amazing to see where we're going, where we're pushing certain narratives, to be honest.
If I could follow up with the sort of next question, if that's all right, because there's this question for me, and you've sort of gotten right to the sort of doorway of it. It's a question I ask myself all the time. It's obviously a speculative question since we're not in charge of universities or higher ed broadly.
Sure.
But it strikes me that there are two. I mean, there are other ways too, but sort of two bookend ways of thinking about Black studies. That it was founded because there's something lurking, maybe, as you've come back to this question of methodology a number of times, like a latent methodology and intellectual tradition that the academy had not represented. And now with Black studies, it's developing and sort of becoming, moving from area studies to something like a discipline, right? So that's one trajectory, one way to understand the trajectory of Black studies. The other way, which I think often gets to the campus politics of it in the late 1960s and early 1970s, which was if you went to an English department or a history department, philosophy, religion department, there's no study of Black folks there. So you need Black studies to establish a scholarly sort of paper trail or paper pile or mountains and mountain ranges of research on these. Now, one trajectory that can take is to say that in the end, the point of Black studies is to no longer need Black studies. So that if you want to understand Black literary history, you go to an English department. Black religion, you go to a religion department, art history, etc. Right. So one is sort of Black studies is designed to eventually no longer be needed. And the other is no, Black studies is its own thing. So long as we take these questions, of the intellectual tradition and its methods and reckoning with Black life seriously. So I'm curious how you would think about these two trajectories, which is sort of more appealing, more convincing, more intriguing, or maybe more productive. Maybe one seems terrible as an idea. Maybe both seem like great plans, but this is more of like a speculation.
No, I love it. We do these scenarios all the time. So it's in my wheelhouse to do. I would love if, we didn't need it. But we're 60 years removed maybe from the first, it would assume racism is over, in terms of like big R, racism, right, is absolved. That would be amazing.
I just have to. I was just reading this essay the other day, a Richard Wright essay on. I forget. I think it's like the literature of the Negro American or something. It's in the Black Power collection, and he says you'll know that there's an end to racism when Black writers are no longer writing Black stories. And that's sort of what sparked that line from Wright, who's always being audacious and sometimes offensively so, sometimes interestingly so. But it's sort of like that came to mind when you said, well, if racism was over, then maybe we could talk about the end of Black studies.
Yeah, that'd be amazing to talk about at that time. I think that'd be great.
Does not seem to be around the corner.
not this corner, not yet. But you never know. But yeah, I think that's a good perspective to put it in. Right, there's so many different directions that it could go. Is it an ad hoc kind of supplemental area studies, or is this something that we want to ingrain? I think that disciplines are asking themselves that question, or should maybe ask themselves their question, because we just hired another Black person who's going to start next year, maybe the year after. But I was, the one to represent Black religions here in the religion department, right? So, do we have one of those in English? Yes, right. So I think that's not just a Black studies question. I think the disciplines have to ask themselves that question. I think religion overall as a discipline has tried to, right? You have Native American religion, Asian religion, Judaism. Typically, these are the kind of world religions people have. So to see that they're valuing the African, because our religious studies department that I got my religious studies degree, we had a Black person, but they weren't teaching Black church studies or Black. They were just teaching religion. They weren't teaching anything about Black. So, yeah, I think that's a lot of onus to put on Black studies. I think it should operate in as many facets as it can until maybe it's not needed anymore. I think that would be my take on it. And I try to operate within this discipline, right? And I can't do it all, right? Because they're like, I asked history of, people could get credit for my African American history of religion tradition. They're like, well, are you going to do Africa? And I'm like, goodness gracious, Africa, like all of Africa? Like, we do Africa.
That's a lot of square miles.
Ooh, that's a lot. I'm like, we need another hire. Get someone to do Africa. Get someone to the Caribbean. But it's what I love is that their students want to know. So there is a need for it that they're not teaching. So I love the need. It'd be nice if the disciplines took this into consideration and there'd be no need for it in the first place, but they haven't. What will they do? And ultimately what we do, I think that's an interesting position though that I hadn't considered, to be honest, to filter Black studies. Do we want to filter Black studies PhDs in different places? And I even know actually when we were in school, a lot of people got double PhDs because of, I think, I won't say that this is the truth, but I'd say it was probably the anxiety of the market, right? Yeah, all of our methods were outsourced. Ashley's PhD is just as education as the people that got an education PhD at Michigan State. However, with a Black Studies degree, can she teach an education? Black Studies allows that for everyone, but does every other discipline allow it for Black Studies? That has not been the case traditionally. So it'd be nice, right, that if Black Studies PhD could just get a religion job. But I'm sure that my Master's of Theology from Vanderbilt had some leeway there, right? I don't know, right? So that would be nice, though. I like that idea. I don't know, but I really like that idea. People like the idea of assimilation, and then decided that probably wasn't a good idea. So I don't know.
Well, I do always think, just as a side note, and then I'll turn it back over to Ashley. But I always think when is the future of Black studies as a field to continue to be Black studies or to dissolve back into disciplines, I always look at, it's your partner in your department classics. I mean, there are not ancient Greeks or ancient Romans walking around, but classics remains a thing because it does have its own methodologies and concerns that can't be reduced to disciplines. So, strangely, probably the most hostile group, like as a field, to the idea of Black studies. Martin Bernal, I think, put us on this path with classics, but they're actually an interesting case study always for me. Like they persist because they have such distinct questions, and I'm like, and I think we should, so we can be the classics at some point.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting. I'll leave with this or something. One of the preachers that I'm examining her sermons, she gives one at Duke, and she talks about it's on Martin Luther King Day, and she says, should we erase the entire legacy of Martin Luther King? And then she goes into listing off a lot of like Alexander, what's his name? Solon Collin and Cicero and Churchill and all of these people's famous quotes for the necessity of history. Right. She says, it's these people that say we need to talk about history, but yet we don't want to talk about MLK's commitment to economic equality. And then it just kind of falls flat. But classics. Yeah. Classics is interesting and necessary.
Thank you so much for your time. I do know that, you are working on your book. It'll come out next year. Do you want to say a little bit about that before we end?
Please.
Oh, wow. Sure. And I'll try to talk about it through the discipline of Black studies. How about that? So then we'll wrap it up there. My book is it's entitled Ain't I a Preacher? Black or Womanist Religious Rhetoric. So let's see, or theo-rhetoric. And it's looking at 3 Black women preachers who are self-proclaimed womanists and Black intellectuals. So they're teaching as well. And I'm looking at their sermons in the way that others have looked at Black women's speeches and saw this kind of liberative kind of social justice narrative to a lot of their speeches. When it comes to Black preaching and Black church and Black preaching and in general, the monolith is that they're all Black men. And we get a lot of great ideas about consciousness and language from Black preaching. Black people who do Black scholars who do rhetoric, they laud the church for being the large provider of Black rhetoric and Black consciousness, but they don't examine the sermons of Black women. So that's what I attempt to do here. And I look at their sermons and generate a theory of how to do that in the future with other Black women. And so I'm looking at Black women homileticians. I'm looking at Black ethicists and rhetorics to kind of develop what am I seeing empirically from these sermons. And it's been phenomenal to kind of look at. I was able to talk to you all just now about what one of the women did at Duke University and kind of putting the audience in their seat about Martin Luther King, which I think is a rhetorical tactic. She uses cultural texts as complementary texts to the Bible to insert a certain type of authoritative subjectivity. And I think they all do. And that's what the book is about. Yeah, I'm wrapping up chapter 3 this week and interested in getting it out there. So thank you for letting me talk about it. In terms of Black studies, I center these women's stories. I start off with Sojourner Truth's infamous Ain't I a Woman speech, right? That's where I get the title from. And even in that sermon, she breaks down poverty, relationships to Christianity, that don't include her own subjectivity, right? She says, where does your Christ come from? A woman and God. There was no man there, right? So that her own hermeneutic of suspicion, right? This idea that, what are you talking about? And I'm a woman and God doesn't even come. So that same spirit of trying to figure out, and she wasn't invited there, right? So this kind of authoritative, subjective kind of rhetoric to see it. So that's what the book is trying to do. If I could be half as great as Sir Garner, the book will be great. Sure. But the women I look at are amazing. Three preachers. One is Ebony Marshall Terman. She actually has just sued the Abyssinian Church in New York City for gender discrimination for being a pastor there, which I think shows the stakes of my work, that a predominant Black church is not ready for a predominant for a woman to pastor the church. That says a lot. Teresa Fry Brown, she's the Bandy Professor of Homiletics at Emory University, and then Vashti McKenzie, who was the first Black woman bishop for the AME Church. So these are women who are exceptional in their field. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I can't wait to read this. Sounds fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
Super important. Really important.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah. Yeah. I love it. Thank you both for having me. This has been great to talk about Black slaves. I'm definitely going to tune into some others for sure. I'm so excited about it. Yeah. Thank you
I loved
so
hearing
much.
all of this.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you. And I apologize so much for being a little tardy. I couldn't get the internet to work.
You're absolutely fine.
All right. Don't take care.
All right. See ya. See you both.